So good morning and welcome to our panel discussion on the global implications of the CrowdStrike shutdown. I'm Professor John Acosta, your moderator today, and today's conversation will explore the complexities of this incident and its broader impact on cybersecurity. Before we begin, it's important to clarify that the CrowdStrike shutdown was not caused by a cyber attack, but rather by an unintended software update. And so to put context into this, we're going to play a short video.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Hoda Kotb.
Good morning. Good to see you. You are coming on the air right now with breaking news. A massive global technical outage tied to CrowdStrike, which is a major cybersecurity provider, has knocked critical computer infrastructure offline all across the country and, in fact, all around the world. It's an issue with a software update. It's impacting lots and lots of Microsoft computer systems worldwide, from businesses to emergency services, 911, traffic lights, transit systems, and it's having a major impact on airlines as well. American, Delta, United, they're all keeping their flights grounded. You're looking at some live scenes from the airport. It is chaos again, 6 a.m. on the East Coast, and this is the scene now. They're having difficulty even printing any kind of boarding passes. This, of course, is a developing situation. The full scope of this problem remains to be seen. And Brian, as we get started right here in Studio 1A, we should point out computers at NBC News right here as we're getting on the air. We're trying to do some workarounds here to get on the air, but this is something that's affecting people worldwide.
Yeah, and other newsrooms, our partners over at Sky News, having issues as well. I mean, this is impacting all different types of businesses. When you talk about airlines, you also talk about, just 911 services, in some cases reporting outages as well. And you're even hearing of anecdotes of banks in other countries experiencing that. We don't yet have reporting of banks in the United States being impacted by this, but this appears to be not just in the United States, worldwide, and across different types of industries.
This definitely speaks to what I feel like is the fragility of the situation. It's like this is not a cyber attack. This is a computer kind of snafu that happened.
Yeah, and just to kind of walk you through exactly what's going on here. So this appears to be an issue between CrowdStrike and Microsoft. So CrowdStrike, for those that aren't familiar, is a cybersecurity firm that basically provides businesses with a way to foolproof their systems from being hacked. Now, apparently what happened was that CrowdStrike was working on some sort of update. We just heard from the CEO in the last few minutes describing this as not a security incident or cyber attack. So I will repeat that again. It doesn't appear to be a cyber attack at issue here. But the reason why CrowdStrike is so instrumental to not just businesses here in the United States, but around the world, is because any sort of business that hires CrowdStrike to basically foolproof their systems, well, they're going to be incorporating that into their computers. So if they get that, it's being plugged into Microsoft computers. If there's an issue with CrowdStrike, it takes down all of those Microsoft computers that are related to that. The company's saying Mac and Linux computers are not impacted, but again, this is very widespread.
That's interesting because I think what happened was a lot of people, this was happening in Australia, Europe, while we were all sleeping. We woke up and we were like, what's going on? But what people are finding is they're getting on their computers or at the bank or at the airline and they're seeing just a blue screen. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, well, the term for this is called the blue screen of death. And I don't know if we have examples that we can show on the screen right now, but we've been seeing it even in our newsrooms this morning. So it's basically this blue screen that has this prompt that says, you're having issues, and they're basically trying to figure out a workaround. But that essentially bricks your computer. You are unable to log in. Now, that's scary for any person that's just trying to log into their personal computer, although it's not clear if your personal computer has CrowdStrike. If it doesn't have that plugin or have that cybersecurity layer, you likely won't be affected because of the nature of what we understand this issue to be. But for all these enterprise companies, which is translation for corporate customers that use this protection, well, that's a major issue. If you can't log in, you can't print out the boarding passes to get people on their planes. You can't, as a bank teller, even get fired up to help open up someone's deposit account. This is a major issue. CrowdStrike says that they have an issue. They identified the issue, they isolated it, and there's a fix that has been deployed. How long that fix takes to basically patch over all this, we don't know, as it seems like anecdotes of these issues and outages are still out there.
And when you're thinking about it, like 911, all of these things, hospitals, like time of the essence when it comes to this. But you did bring up the airlines, and a lot of folks, I have a good friend who's on the way to the airport who's texting me saying, what's going on with all these flights? This is the scene at the airport, and we have NBC's Antonia Hilton. She joins us now. I think she is at Newark Airport. Antonia, what's the scene there?
Good morning. Well, passengers are arriving here to Newark to chaos, long lines, and intense frustrations. The kiosks are down. The computers are down. The boards where travelers typically go to find out what's going on with their delays and their cancellations, they're not updating properly. They're showing just a couple cancellations and delays, and passengers tell me that it's not reflected.
So that was just most of the news report on that. So joining us today is Mark Stanford, founder and CEO of OpenStack, who brings over 25 years of offensive cybersecurity experience. Mark is known for his focus on vulnerabilities, attacks against AI, and critical infrastructure security. And William Miller, president and owner of Miltech Media Technology, LLC, an expert in media standards and technology consultancy. Bill also holds leadership roles in organizations as IEEE Broadcast Technology Society and the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. And he brings a unique perspective on media technology standards and digital security. So, Mark and Bill, how should organizations effectively communicate during incidents caused by non-malicious events, such as software updates?
Well, media companies are not monolithic. I think it's better to ask if the individuals making systems design and acquisition decisions understand these issues. In particular, I think you need to ask if the decisions are being made by a corporate IT department or a broadcast IT group. At ABC, pre-Disney, we were fortunate enough to have a corporate IT group who were willing to sit down and talk to the broadcast people and decide after review of the risks and consequences that they wanted no part of the broadcast IT infrastructure. So the broadcast guys who understood what the risks were and the system design implications were able to do their own thing, and I think that stood them in good standing. I don't know that this is an issue where a standard is necessarily going to help. We can't, there is not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution where we can say, thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. Where our standards community can help is the development of recommended practices, which are, you should do this, you should consider that, and also engineering guidelines, which are tutorial document. So we can get people to understand the risks. It particularly could be helpful to the broadcast guys who know what the problems are in helping to explain it to their corporate masters who have to approve the budget to get the job done properly. Part of the problem is that corporate IT types don't necessarily understand the concept of hard real time, where if you don't get the bits out now, you don't get them back later because time just continually runs. So if you blow the commercial now, it's going to cost you a make good and a black eye on the air. And every second of dead air, you're going to lose a certain proportion of your audience who aren't going to come back. So the other thing is broadcasters have a very high public profile. So that means you're basically walking around with a target painted on you. And your attackers could be anybody from a nation state to a bunch of 12-year-old kids trying to impress their friends.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think to build upon that, I think during the event, communication is the key. So personally, my initial communication was to respond to my parents and say, no, I didn't cause this, because they did ask me. And then I think you need a plan, right? I mean, beyond just an incident response plan, there needs to be a crisis response plan. The default is always going to be, everyone's going to assume you've been hacked, you've lost all your data. So in the instance of something like CrowdStrike, where it's just, I have a software vendor who broke all my systems, get that information out there, be coherent, be consistent, building on what Bill said about senior management, make sure they're involved in the process, right? The fundamental failure that we see when we work with organizations around incident response, crisis response, is there's this disjointed approach, right? The tech guys are in one room doing tech stuff. The business people are in a different room. Nobody talks. Inconsistent messages come out and things just start to spiral. So I think really have a crisis response plan and be transparent. You didn't cause this. Someone else did. Pass the buck even. I mean, it's just what you have to do.
Do you think that there is an over-dependency on third-party cybersecurity companies, and how does that impact the personal company structure and things like that?
Well, since I run a third-party cybersecurity vendor, no, use more of them. Yeah, I mean, I think there is, right? I mean, security is really complicated. And I think that there's this race to simplification. And I think that tends to create problems, right? So first of all, I don't want to be responsible. Somebody else do it. Secondly, there's always budgetary issues, right? And there's the perception that if I use a third party, it's cheaper than doing it myself. So I think that's an issue. So I think there is an over-reliance on third parties. I think there's far too much check the box when it comes to this. Yes, we have, an EDR like CrowdStrike. Yes, we have a SOC. Yes, we have a pen test. Yes, we did an audit. But there's no actual, well, does this really work? Is this good? Have we got a good outcome that's in the context of our business? Or are we just doing what everyone else does?
Yeah. Unless you've got the resources to completely provide your own cybersecurity solutions, and basically nobody does, you're always going to be dependent on third parties to some extent. This means you're always going to have some exposure when a vendor either screws up or gets hacked. And we've seen examples of both of those. To protect yourself, you need to have the resource, and that means people, and that means money, to oversee and control what your vendors are doing, and to control what access they have to your mission critical systems. You can't assume that your vendors are going to test products with the same rigor that you would. And that, I think, is the real concern. The problem, of course, then becomes that you then have to hire other vendors like Mark to check on your security vendors.
Okay. So, Mark, how do incidents like this CrowdStrike shutdown arise from software updates rather than malicious attacks? And are they reshaping the way we approach preparedness?
So to the answer to the second part, no, because nobody seems to be doing much about it. I think there's always been the risk of third-party software, right? I mean, Microsoft Windows is a third-party piece of software, right? Linux is a third-party piece of software, Mac OS. So start from there. You're bringing in something somebody else has made, and you're implying a certain level of trust into them because you can't go and audit all this software, right? So I think this problem has always been there. We've done various red team engagements where we've said, okay, let's work through a scenario of this critical piece of software you use is popped by a bad guy, right? So if you take SolarWinds, which is a nice third-party software example, that's what happens when third-party software goes bad. CrowdStrike is what happens when you just trust the vendor that they're going to update it. But that problem's always been there. And so far, I don't think we've seen anyone do anything different. The CrowdStrike outage really just led to a whole bunch of lawsuits. Delta's trying to sue them, right? CrowdStrike sent everyone a voucher for some coffee. It's all done. Move on. Let's wait for the next problem, right? So I don't think anything's changed. And we've always known about this risk. We've just kind of stuck our head in the sand a lot.
I would add to that. The part of the problem with the CrowdStrike outage was that the user had no control over when this update was propagated. I believe that has changed. They are now allowing the customers to regulate when these updates go out, so that they have a chance to test them on what you call a canary system. In other words, a typical user system, apply the patch, see if it works. If it doesn't work, then you know you've got a problem. You don't propagate it out to your whole system. Part of the problem is that we're basically running software monocultures. And just like any monoculture, like even on a farm, if everything you have is identical, all you need is one attack, one service, one vulnerability, and you lose everything. If you have a diversity of systems, then at least you have some possibility of not everything going down at once. And we'll talk more about that later. But there are techniques that you can use, none of which are new, many of which we have used in the broadcast industry for years. They may not stop everything, but they might keep you on the air.
Okay, so we've established that companies and cybersecurity companies often are siloed. Bill, can you make any recommendations as to how we can maybe make communication better or remove the silos or anything like that?
Well, As far as the silos are concerned, I mean, I don't think that you're going to be able to change the workflows. One of the things I discovered in years of feature upgrades and software updates and things like that is that every bug, one person's bug is another person's undocumented feature. And users are very hostile to changing their workflows, particularly in a live on-air environment. In any kind of pressure situation where you need to get the job done and you need to get it done quickly, you can't be changing feature sets on people. So that tends to imply that you're going to have silos, and I don't think you're necessarily going to be able to break out of it. What you need to do is to have some systems design where you can mitigate problems before they propagate across an entire network.
I think also just to add, there's an age-old problem here, right? Which is technical people never actually understand the business they're working in. I think, I was doing an unofficial survey the other day of non-technical people's view of cybersecurity people, and all the feedback is not suitable for this floor. So I think you have this problem where technical people go down rabbit holes. They talk to business people and they don't put it in a business context. And that just reinforces these silos. So if you're going to break it down, take your security program, take whatever you're doing from a technical perspective and say, what's this look like for the business? Because I don't need CrowdStrike on every single computer that I run potentially. If I've got my critical servers where I'm doing post-production work, right? They don't need to be online even, or maybe they do, but it can be firewalled off in a really good way, right? So think about, what does the business do? How does it make money, right? And then how can the programs we're doing, the technology we're doing, support that and put it in that context? Because technical people, especially security people, and I know a few of them, they just think anyone who doesn't understand technology is an idiot, and that's a really bad place to start.
On the other hand, I think part of the vendors have an issue as well, which is that they tend to isolate their engineers and their tech people from the actual customer. There's always a product manager in the middle. I had an experience once years ago where I went out as my company's representative to a manufacturing site, and they asked me if I had a half an hour to come talk to some of their engineering staff. And I now know what it feels like to be the food when it's feeding time in the lion's cage. Because I walked into a conference room and there were a whole bunch of engineers sitting around that table who'd never been exposed to a real live customer before.
Okay. So Bill, you touched on this earlier, but I wanted to follow up. Should there be, might incidents like this shape the future of broadcast standards and regulations? And if yes, how do you see that happening?
Standards and regulations, again, as I say, you're not going to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. I don't think that you can necessarily dictate standards on this, but certainly there's an opportunity for recommendations, recommended practices, and absolutely there's a need for education. Within the SMPTE standards community, for instance, we certainly have the critical mass of subject matter experts who understand this to be able to come up with recommendations. And that's simply a matter of somebody coming to the standards community or the standards vice president with a proposal to write these things and come up with the resources to actually write them. Because you can't just come in and ask a question and say, do this. You've got to provide the resources to actually get it done. But certainly, this is something that is well within SMPTE scope to do. And I speak as a former engineering vice president of the society.
Okay. So, Mark, are there any particular concerns regarding the integration of artificial intelligence within security systems?
Yeah. I think there are. I mean, I think AI, for the most part, is still a lot of hype, though. So I think we have to be cautious there. I think what we're seeing is protective security systems integrating what's being labeled as AI in the hope that it becomes autonomous. AI is really unsafe right now. We did some work recently where we made an AI chatbot being used by a bank. Firstly, it would start insulting people who asked it questions, and then it would launch cyber attacks against them. So be careful there. So I think that we're going to see this rush towards the integration of AI. I have to do air quotes, sorry, of AI into these solutions. They're going to have, again, like access to the underlying fundamental structures of these systems. They'll bring new vulnerabilities. They'll be rushed in. Those vulnerabilities will actually expand the attack surface for a bad guy, and we'll just have more problems, right? So I think AI is being really slapdash put in there. I think there is some potential for it to be useful, especially in looking at data and saying, all right, this looks like an attack based on old attacks, and it can do it quicker than a human analyst can and so on. But I think there is the potential for some problems, and I think that we'll probably encounter the problems, and then we'll go fix them.
Any thoughts on that, Bill?
Yeah. My concern is that there seems to be an assumption when corporate leaders look at AI, all they see is dollar signs. I can put in this AI system and I can get rid of my people. I can get rid of my overhead. And I think that's a very dangerous thing to do, as Mark says, when you're dealing with a system that you don't fully understand how it thinks, you can't control it, and you have no guarantee that it's not going to become either malevolent or sarcastic. And you're opening your entire business to something that, when fully developed, can think a lot faster than you do and can move a lot faster than you do. If it was me, I'd be scared as hell.
Yep.
So we are. What my thinking is now, I work at a community college, and we're starting to get more trainings on specific things like cybersecurity, for example. So, Mark, do you think that there should be trainings like that on the cybersecurity side to make these cybersecurity personnel and experts more understanding of companies that may not have a lot of knowledge in this area? Like an orientation as to what an employee is maybe not be aware of.
I mean, so there's this ongoing debate around security awareness training for everyone and making people aware of cybersecurity issues. And since I've written about this, I don't think it works. I think everyone should be aware of the problems, right? But I think given that I've been doing social engineering for 20 years, and I have consistently seen organizations that spend a fortune on security awareness fall down because you've got your rational brain and you've got your reptilian brain. I'm going to go mess with that, right? I'm going to mess with your need to be liked, to be loved, to be paid more. I'm going to mess with that. So you can use this rational stuff. I'll give you a real life case in point. So we do these phishing exercises to break into networks. So we'll send out a phish, and the phish is clearly a fake. There's typos, send me your bank account information. Nobody clicks on those links because they've had their security awareness training. 2 weeks later, I'll send you another email. I'll register a domain that looks just like your company, and it will be -security department. I'll say, following the phishing incident 2 weeks ago, we're doing a whole password review, Go to this website we've set up to test your passwords, right? On average, we get about an 80% success rate on those because you have this need to, this person obviously is in my company because they know this happened and they're coming from authority, so I'm going to do it. So it destroys every security awareness training program. I think we have to get to a point where these systems it sounds kind of lame, but they're just secure, right? When I get into my car and I put my seatbelt on, I don't really have to worry about how it works, right? I just drive and I'm, okay, the seatbelt, the airbag, all this stuff is going to work. I think we're a long way off on that from computers. So I think in the time being, there does have to be some kind of training, some sort of awareness of the issues. But again, I still think a more useful training for a lot of technical folks would be go understand the business, understand why it exists, what it does, how it works, and understand how to talk to people in a way that takes complex issues and makes them simple.
Bill, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think we need to go back and look at how some of the fundamentals that we learned from putting together broadcast plants in the past. You know, sometimes you need to go back there. For instance, you really want to separate your broadcast IT systems from your production systems from your business systems. They shouldn't really talk to each other. We used to call this the data condom because the best protection is no connection. Where they do need to talk to each other, you need single-purpose gateways, one function per gateway, dual NICs. You know, don't put them on the same spine and expect to do that in software. Do it hardware. That way, if you have a section that gets compromised, you can pull that gateway and everything else doesn't die. The other issue is that you really need to get away from the software monoculture. Is there a reason that everything has to run Windows 11? To some extent, that's going to be controlled by which vendors you buy your systems from, because the vendor who's selling you a server system, for instance, is not going to change the design or the software core of the control system that's running that to suit your needs. They're going to tell you what they developed on. And I can give you a case in point where one product manager at a particular company, who shall remain nameless, decided that they didn't really like that old-fashioned Unix control system they had on their routing switchers, so they were going to update it to Windows 95, and their entire software development team quit because they weren't going to work on Windows. I suppose you could force a vendor to do stupid things, but you really don't want to. And as I said, the more diverse your environment is, the less of a monoculture it is, the harder it is to crash all of it at once. With the CrowdStrike example, for instance, that was benign. All it did was crash the computers. If that had actually been an attack that had propagated that way, 2 minutes, everybody would have been gone, their data would have disappeared, and any critical files would have been exfiltrated and held for ransom. We got really lucky with that one. It was just dumb error. It wasn't, we didn't need to attribute it to malice because it was stupidity.
Well, with that, we'd like to open up the floor to questions. We really want to hear what you're thinking. Do you have any questions, any thoughts, any comments? Don't be shy.
I have a little question. Coming from Europe, ISO 27000 is widely adopted there. I was wondering how well adopted is it here, NIST, for example, or other security standards that might help us improve safety of our work operations. And also, how can education, of course, because I'm running education at Simpson, how can education help in this case?
Well, first I'm going to say that I'm not familiar with ISO 27000. Admittedly, I'm not in the thick of things anymore the way that I used to be, but I am not familiar with it. But it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people hadn't heard of it here. As far as the society's education approaches, again, we need to develop tutorial material and recommended practices, and then we need to tell people that these things are available. We need to teach them what they are. So that's where the society's educational outreach, I think, could be extremely beneficial.
So as far as ISO we see rarely right now. I mean, 27001's been around for a while. It's been updated and so on. NIST, which you brought up, the NIST CSF, actually, I really like that, and we see that a lot. And the reason why the CSF is good is because it's not prescriptive, right? It's what's your current security program look like? Where do you want to get to? What's the gap? Let's fix that. So to go back to my earlier point, it allows the management of a company to actually say, this is where we want security to be. Because every company doesn't need to have the same security as the Department of Defense, right? Lots of especially small companies that do a lot of work with small media companies, they're not going to spend 5 weeks trying to implement a security standard, right? So I think the CSF is really good. ISO, has been around and sort of comes and goes. We see a lot of service providers looking to get ISO certification, but that's about it. So I think NIST is much more popular in the US.
Any other questions? Thoughts, comments?
Bill, I'm Bob Seidel, formerly CBS CTO. One of the things Bill commented on that I thought should be emphasized is the canary test system. We always had a requirement that we operated an on-air test system totally separate from the actual system that was running the dollars through the plant. And this enabled us to test software at our leisure and also train operators of new features that would be included. So we always emphasized that the test system was critical before we released any code anywhere, and that local area network was totally separate from the main and backup air networks, as you said, which were separate from the business systems. So multiple firewalls, 3 firewalls at least, protection, but the test system became the most critical point of verification before any code was allowed in from any vendor, whether it was a push code to ever go down into the air system. And was ABC doing a similar type of approach?
ABC was heading towards that approach. Certainly they had done that at ESPN, who got there first. And frankly, every other multi-network operator of whom I am aware did that same thing. You always had one isolated system, and it served 2 purposes. One was it was your sandbox for testing software updates, because each individual part of the system probably was getting different updates at different times, and you had to run those updates to make sure everybody played together nicely. If you didn't, you knew you were going to end up with egg on your face. And also, when you weren't doing software testing, it was the ideal environment to train your operators, because if they screwed up, I mean, it's like having a flight simulator as opposed to flying the airplane. If you crash the simulator, nobody dies.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thoughts, comments? No? Okay. Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you much.